That, my friends, is called the Devil's Triad. Notes that are designed to invoke the diabolical. And that means today we're going to be talking about Satan. In 2018, the devil appeared outside Arkansas State Capitol, wreaking havoc and striking terror into the hearts of the locals. Then he disappeared and reappeared in 2023 in the Iowa State Capitol. His horns rose high over his head. He had wings on and a pentagram on his forehead. A 35-year-old man named Michael Cassidy couldn't take it anymore and attacked the creature, punching it and destroying it. He was charged with a hate crime. At the time, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis immediately posted on X that he would help Mr. Cassidy with his legal fees because, as Ron DeSantis wrote, quote, "Satan has no place in our society and should not be recognized as a religion by the federal government," end quote. When I was a youngster back in the 1980s and into the 90s, you may recall the Satanic Panic. And this was a moment in American history where we were all freaking out because people were finding pentagrams. I myself ran across a pentagram in the local park and had a kind of freak out. Oh my God, Satanists are in the neighborhood. All of this was spawned by a book written in the 80s. That book was written by a psychologist named Lawrence Pasder, and it was called Michelle Remembers. Bestseller, and it influenced a lot of people because Dr. Pasder claimed to have coaxed out of one of his patients, Michelle, the hidden, suppressed, unconscious memory of being abused by a satanic ritual cult. And people all over Canada and the United States started accusing childcare workers, teachers, parents, that they were sort of in a satanic cult that was abusing children, and they were getting away with it because the kids, couldn't remember it. And this was all being discovered by a psychological method called recovered memory therapy. And it's since been debunked, or there's a lot of doubt been thrown on it since this occurred in the 80s and the 90s. And what happened was therapists were finding kids that were telling them stories about these terrible ceremonies that they were involved in, and which basically then culminated in some kind of abuse. But we now understand that the therapist was consciously, or more often unconsciously, accidentally leading the child by certain kinds of leading questions to tell a story that, the child really never happened to the child, but the therapist, in hearing it, felt confirmed and felt that their fears were being corroborated. So it led to this cycle in which horrific things that were completely imaginary were coming out and being recorded as factual. Altogether, something like 12,000 accusations occurred during the Satanic Panic in the 80s, and none of those had been confirmed or proven. So that was when I was growing up in the 1980s, and at this time, some of you will remember, this was the sort of rise of heavy metal culture. And those of us who lived through it remember it fondly. I was a teenager, and heavy metal had sort of been big in the underground, but suddenly it was exploding like on MTV and videos, and it made its way into the popular culture in a way that it hadn't before. And this was really exciting because the energy of heavy metal was just so great, and it was deviant, and it was rebellious, and we loved it. Briefly, my own foray into heavy metal culture is amusing. I was a mediocre, talented artist in high school, and so these friends of mine came to me and said, "Hey man, would you sort of do an album cover, paint an album cover for this heavy metal band that we're representing called Bitches Sin?" And even in high school, I thought that was a ridiculous name, but they offered me $50 to do an oil painting. And they said, "Do you know the Edvard Munch painting, The Scream," which is, I think, from 1893? And I said, "Of course, I love Edvard Munch. He's awesome. And many of you have seen this painting. Here it is now." So these guys said, do The Scream, but put some monsters and shit in the background. And I thought, oh boy, but it's $50. So I said, okay, I'll do it. Now, the irony here, of course, is Munch is trying to convey in that painting how existence itself is frightening and horrifying and fills us with angst and alienation. And yet I had to add monsters to it, which totally goes against the painting, but that's neither here nor there. It was $50. So I did it, and I'm going to show you that painting right now. Here it is. I'm delighted to report that Bitches Sin has a following. They're kind of big in England and somewhere else. I'm not sure, look it up. It's worth looking at. So my album cover is part of the heavy metal popular culture story. There you go. So today on Professor Asma's Guide to Unusual Knowledge, we're looking at Satan, the devil, and Baphomet, which is oftentimes confused as being the devil or Satan, but is actually a kind of pagan deity and is a fascinating story in itself. We're also sort of looking at the kind of ongoing battle between Satanists that started a few years ago and is still going strong. It's a kind of rumble in the inferno. And so we're going to be talking about that today as well. So welcome to Professor Asma's Guide to Unusual Knowledge. So our man in Iowa, our Michael Cassidy, who beat up the devil outside the Iowa state capitol, was not fighting the real Satan, obviously. He was fighting with a statue that was made by the Satanic Temple. And the Satanic Temple is a group that's out of Salem, Massachusetts, no surprise there. And they're a very interesting group. But it wasn't even a statue of Satan. It was actually a statue of Baphomet, or sometimes called Baphomet. The word Baphomet is from a French word, so we leave the T silent, but you'll frequently hear it as Baphomet. And Baphomet is a fascinating pagan deity. And let's talk a little bit about the Satanic Temple and their sort of main competitors, the Church of Satan. Because this really, I don't think this is a well-known story. Okay, many of you will know of the Church of Satan, because the Church of Satan was created in 1966 by Anton LaVey. And Anton LaVey was sort of a counterculture figure, was himself a musician, and he was very influenced by the ideas and the writings of philosophers like Nietzsche, and also by Ayn Rand. Many of you will know Ayn Rand is sort of the famous novelist who wrote Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, and has a huge influence among sort of free market, individualist, sort of libertarian types. Anton LaVey said that the Church of Satan was really just Ayn Rand's philosophy mixed with some magic and some rituals. That's actually what he said. And I think that's a fair characterization, because they were only using the images of Satan to sort of show ideas of sort of deviant rebellion and freedom, and ultimately a kind of individualistic hedonism. So for LaVey and the Church of Satan, the goal is to just follow your own pleasure. Do whatever it takes to maximize your own pleasure, and that's the right way to live. So that's essentially the Church of Satan. It goes back to San Francisco, that's where it formed, and it's still alive and well. Along comes, in the last few years, a new organization called the Satanic Temple. The Satanic Temple starts out in 2013, as I said, in Salem, Massachusetts. And they are a very different organization. They are the ones who've made this statue of Baphomet, and they take it around to different state capitals and they put it up. Like they arrive in the middle of the night, they put it up, and people wake up and go down to the courthouse or whatever, and there's a giant statue of what looks like Satan. This organization, the Satanic Temple, sort of likes to chase after and promote progressive causes. And they're also into sort of libertarian freedom and so forth, but they're very different. Their view is sort of informed by the First Amendment question about freedom of religion. Remember, in the First Amendment, the framers of the Constitution said you cannot have an establishment of any one religion. So you have a separation of church and state. The reason why they did this is not because they were against religion, it was because they were trying to protect religion, because there would be many minority religions. They understood that. It was a pluralistic society right from the start, although obviously it was heavily Christian. But they also wanted to protect the state from the influence of any one particular religion. And so that wall of separation between the church and state is something that the Satanic Temple is very much interested in protecting. So when they hear that, there's somewhere like Iowa or Arkansas where people want to put the Ten Commandments at the state capitol, out on the lawn or inside the building, they go there with their sort of satanic statue and they set up as well, because they say, well, look, if the state is going to recognize Christianity, or actually the Ten Commandments would be recognizing Judaism, but if the state wants to recognize them, then they have to recognize us too. There should be no privileged religion. So, and this is basically a kind of an FU argument to someone who wants to establish their religion as dominant. And usually their challenges work. Now, the Satanic Temple does not want you to confuse them with the Church of Satan. When I first saw the Baphomet, I thought, oh, Church of Satan in my head. But I was wrong, because the Satanic Temple says, look, we are for egalitarianism, for the equality of all people. And they claim that the Church of Satan, that one that was started by Anton LaVey, is really much more of a hierarchical, elitist, top-down sort of political and social sort of philosophy. And there's some truth to this. If you look at Anton LaVey's writings and the Church of Satan, you'll find a kind of arrogance about the average person. Satanic, rational hedonism for the elites, the few, and then Christianity, Islam, Judaism for the many, for what they would consider to be the sheeple. And there's sort of a Nietzschean angle here too. If you recall, Nietzsche has this idea that there's going to be an Ubermensch or a Superman, which is really just the idea of somebody who is living this kind of existential hero life, choosing the meaning of their life with freedom and responsibility, and then the rest of everybody else is sort of dismissed as what Nietzsche calls the last man or the herd. And you feel this in Anton LaVey's writings, and you feel it in Ayn Rand's writings too. So we can't confuse the Church of Satan, which is a kind of elitist, satanic, rationalist group, with the Satanic Temple, which is a kind of egalitarian, equity, progressive, satanic, rationalist group. Are we keeping that clear now? Okay, let's continue. So who is this statue that they're actually making and putting out onto the lawns of state capitals? Baphomet is a very interesting and sort of confusing character. He's oftentimes confused with Satan, but as I've said, he's kind of a pagan god. You might think of him as sort of Pan, but he's really confused in with all kinds of medieval permutations and really some satanic elements as well. I think oftentimes when people get in trouble, they'll say, oh, Baphomet is not Satan. But if you look at him more closely and you analyze the sort of symbolism of him, he's really got some of that quality in him too. He's not even a he. He is a non-binary mix of male and female, masculine and feminine. So if you look at an image of Baphomet, which is amazing, this one is very famous. It was done by Eliphas Levi in the 19th century. It's oftentimes, you'll see it on tarot cards, you'll see it in comics. Whenever you want to show Satan, you'll oftentimes see this exact image. But if you look at it more closely, you'll see that it has masculine and feminine qualities. It has feminine breasts. It has a kind of phallic symbol, a male phallus in the center rising up. It's got this goat head, and oftentimes Satan and Baphomet are sort of identified with goats because there's a connotation of goats as being very sexually active, that they're incredibly driven by their sort of libidinal energies. And so oftentimes the character is represented with a goat head. And you'll see written on the arms, look closely, you'll see in Latin two phrases. On one arm it says coagula, and on the other arm it says salve. Coagula means to bring together, and salve means to dissolve or to break apart. And so this character is really a cosmic image of polar opposites that are unified and fused into some kind of harmony. And in that sense, it's a very much a kind of symbol of paganism, of hermeticism, of the esoteric movement. And it makes sense because the person who drew this or published it in their book, Eliphas Levi, is very much a hermetic magi or sort of magician of the late 19th century. So Eliphas Levi was basically very close to becoming a priest. He was going to be ordained at the seminary, and he left suddenly and instead went to study magic and the Hermetica and esoteric and occult traditions. He got really into tarot. He ends up in Paris, starts writing a bunch of books about this stuff. And Baphomet becomes a central figure for him because in Baphomet, you get this kind of pre-Christian, pagan set of values. And this idea that the world is a mix of good and bad, pain and joy. And the goal in life is to sort of find your way through this in a pagan tradition rather than in the sort of monotheistic traditions. For Eliphas Levi and the other sort of esotericists of this time, there's no such thing as being like all good or all bad or all male or all female. It's a really kind of holistic approach to the world, and it looks for this other way of sort of understanding metaphysics. In short, everything is inside everything else. And that's a very sort of classic occult view of the world. And it's why they think magic is a way to sort of bring about the sort of good things in your life. So Eliphas Levi has a big influence eventually on people like Aleister Crowley, and then all the way up to Anton LaVey. So we're really looking at the lineage here that goes from Eliphas Levi up through Aleister Crowley, up to Anton LaVey. And what's interesting about Eliphas Levi is he gives us many of the kind of tropes or stereotypes that we now think of as important within this tradition of magic and the occult. For example, he looks at sigils like the pentagrams. So there I was, as a kid freaking out about the pentagram. But Levi tells us that there's good and there's bad pentagrams. Pentagram, of course, is a five-pointed star. There's an ancient Christian use of the pentagram in which the points are designed to correspond to the 5 wounds on Jesus during the crucifixion. So you've got the 2 hands, the 2 feet, and then the piercing of the side. And so it was used as a symbol to indicate in the very early days that you are a Christian. And then a little later, in the medieval and then the early Renaissance period, it was also thought, these are people like Cornelius Agrippa, it was also thought to represent the 5 elements. So you have earth, air, fire, and water, but you also have the 5th element of ether or pneuma. And this sort of was a way of also talking about, well, we can manipulate these different natural substances and try to make things like gold. So in alchemy, there's this sort of constant attempt to sort of find the secret key to manipulating the elements into things you want, like gold. So it's no accident then that Eliphas Levi puts a pentagram on the forehead of this Baphomet character, which scares the hell out of people when they see it on a court building lawn. But what he's suggesting there is what he thinks is the good pentagram. In his book, Transcendental Magic, he says, quote, "The pentagram signifies the domination of the mind over the elements, and by this sign are enchained the demons of the air, the spirits of fire, the phantoms of the water, and ghosts of earth. Equipped with this sign, and suitably disposed, you may behold the infinite through the medium of that faculty which is like the soul's eye, and you will be ministered unto by legions of angels and fiends." Okay, sounds good, because if you get this right, you have both the angels and the fiends doing your bidding. Not bad. However, Levi says, you're not going to have angels and fiends working for you unless you get the direction of the pentagram correct. The point has to be at the top. The single point has to be at the top. And that indicates spirit emerging out of matter. And if you turn it around and have the point on the bottom and the 2 points on the top, then you have spirit descending into matter and being lost into the flesh and the world of pain and suffering and sin. So a goat-headed, sabbatic goat-headed creature with a pentagram on its forehead that's basically an androgyne mix of male and female is going to scare a mainstream Christian. And Eliphas Levi knew that, and when the Satanic Temple puts it on the lawn, they know that. But what most people don't know is that this image has been scaring people all the way back to the Knights Templar in the 12th century in France. And this is an amazing little sort of nugget to the story that a lot of people don't know. In the 12th century, a French group of soldiers formed a militia, and they were basically the Knights of the Solomon Temple, came to be called the Knights Templar. Their job was to escort devotees and pilgrims to the Holy Land and assure their safe passage. Eventually, though, they started to get bigger, more powerful, and they started to engage in banking because people had to sort of go on these big trips, and so they had to have money available to them. One of the great enemies of the Knights Templar was a king. In 1307, King Philip IV of France was actually in debt, in a lot of debt, to the Knights Templar, and he hit on this idea that if he accused them of heresy and got them basically branded as heretics, he would be able to get out of his debt. And he didn't want all this competition with power anyway, so he convinces the Pope, Pope Clement V, to arrest the top leadership of the Knights Templar. And this includes the Grand Master, Jacques de Molay. And Jacques de Molay is interrogated, and he and others are basically tortured to confess to being sort of secret heretics. And the thing that they're accused of is worshiping or paying some kind of ritualistic satanic type tribute to Baphomet. They confess to this, but remember, they're tortured. It is true that the Knights Templar have a secret initiation. Well, who doesn't? You're gonna have a secret group or a powerful militia. You gotta have a secret initiation. But what happens is that the king and the Pope accuse them during the secret initiation of actually pissing on the crucifix and kissing a Baphomet statue. Now that is trouble. Add to the trouble the fact that Baphomet may actually be an old French corrupt way of saying Mohammed. And so now you've got double heresy. You've got something that looks pagan, and you've got something that looks like you're in cahoots with the Islamic, the Muslim tradition. And for French Catholics in the 12th century, that ain't gonna fly. In 1310, the king and the Pope basically collaborate to have something like 56 or 57 of these knights, these leaders of the Knights Templar, burned at the stake. And Jacques de Molay is actually still in prison. Eventually, a few years later, he is actually burned at the stake, the last of the Knights Templar that we know of. So it's an interesting story in the way because just like Jacques de Molay was sort of demonized as a pagan, and Baphomet is demonized as Satan, and our man Michael Cassidy is demonizing Baphomet on the courthouse lawn, we have a sort of a tradition of what I'd call demonization, of sort of witch hunting, when in fact Jacques de Molay was not the enemy of the people, was not, a Satanist. Baphomet appears to be a pagan hero of harmony and tolerance. And basically the Church of Satan, or the Satanic Temple, rather, is actually a kind of progressive organization for social and cultural egalitarianism. It's kind of remarkable how stuff gets flipped on its head. All right, flipping on your head is a good place to end for today's episode. Come back for more of Professor Asma's Guide to Unusual Knowledge. And if you like this kind of stuff and want to support us, check out our Patreon page. See you over there at the Patreon page for some cool additional material. And always, stay curious, friends.